My next guest is very special to me. I have to say, when he was on the show about a month and a half ago, the feedback I had from you, the listeners, was enormously positive. As you know, we have discussed the Kennedy assassination on a number of different fronts through Craig Roberts, who was a former sniper in the United States military, who's been on the show a number of times, who's written a number of books on the Kennedy assassination, to one of former President Kennedy's members of his Secret Service detail, Abraham Bolden, who's been on this show several times. And then Dr. Don Miller came on the show, and Don is not only a great physician, but he has developed a unique perspective on what happened in Dallas in November of 1963 with the assassination of President Kennedy, because his association with two of President Kennedy's physicians, his family friends, and also as one of them as a co-worker. The feedback I received was many people said, I really thought that it was the whole Oswald thing, but every time I listen to you interview Craig Roberts or Abraham Bolden, I think, you know what? There really is something more to this. There was some other force, maybe this new world order that you keep talking about behind the assassination. But what people said to me in huge numbers was, your interview with Dr. Don Miller closed the deal, because the information he presented on the medical forensic evidence was indisputable. I'm very, very pleased to have back with me Dr. Don Miller. He is a cardiac surgeon and emeritus professor of surgery at the University of Washington School of Medicine in Seattle. He is a member of Doctors for Disaster Preparedness and writes articles on a variety of subjects at a great website, a site I go to every day, Lou Rockwell, ROCKWELL.com. His website, I encourage you to go there as well, is donaldmiller.com. Dr. Miller, welcome back to Operation Freedom.
Hello? Yes.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
So, folks, I encourage you to go to davejanda.com and go to the last interview we did with Dr. Miller. It was very instructive as far as what transpired in November 63. But let's give a brief review, Don, before we launch into another aspect of the New World Order. Don, as a surgeon, as a medical practitioner for decades, do you believe that the narrative that President Kennedy was assassinated from behind by a lone gunman by the name of Lee Harvey Oswald is in fact true or fictitious?
Entirely fictitious.
And educate our listeners, just in brief format, which you're so good at doing, why you believe that to be the case.
Well, the simplest evidence is that the bullet that killed him was shot from the front. So an assassin in a building up behind him couldn't have been the killer where Oswald allegedly was. The bullet that killed Kennedy went in his forehead and blew out the back of his head, and that's the cause of death.
And why do you believe it was shot from the front, Don?
Well, there is testimony of witnesses in Dealey Plaza. There's a testimony of the doctors at Parkland Hospital that saw a big hole blown out in the back of his head, which could only be a wound of exit, not a wound of entrance. Mm-hmm. And then there was an autopsy which was contrived to show it was a single Oswald was a single gunman from behind, and there is incontrovertible evidence that the autopsy was falsified, and records that have been released in recent years prove that beyond a shadow of a doubt.
And one of the physicians involved in the autopsy was the physician of President Kennedy, Dr. George Berkeley, and you were family friends with Dr. Berkeley, correct?
That's correct.
And there was a problem with those autopsy records, correct?
Correct.
Now, you also were friends with Dr. Malcolm Perry. Who was Malcolm Perry?
He was a surgeon in Texas at Parkland Hospital that performed the tracheotomy on Kennedy when he was brought there after he was shot.
And after one long night of operating with Dr. Perry, after he had moved to the Seattle area, what did Dr. Perry tell you about that event?
Well, I had worked with him for several years up to that point, and we did surgery together on complex cardiac vascular cases, and he knew my interest in the Kennedy assassination, but he had refused in a blanket way to discuss it with anyone. But that particular night, as we discussed in the previous podcast, after we'd been operating together for many hours, when I asked him once again, he said that unequivocally it was a wound of entrance in the neck, meaning he had to have been shot from the front, and which controverts the single bullet theory that the Warren Commission put up to explain how Oswald could have shot only 2 bullets, one of which went through Kennedy's back, out his neck, in and out of Connolly's chest, in and out of his wrist, and landing in his thigh. And the fact that Dr. Perry, a very experienced trauma surgeon, said in no uncertain terms it was a wound of entrance invalidates that theory.
And in fact, Dr. Perry was pressured by our own government to change his testimony, wasn't he?
Oh, yes, and we actually know who the Secret Service person was, and that he was indeed pressured. And so in public forums, Dr. Perry would say that it must have been a wound of exit and I was mistaken. But privately, to me and to another physician, he, after his news conference, which he said without a doubt it was a wound of entrance, he said that it was clearly a wound of entrance, not a wound of exit, as he was forced by the government to testify in public.
Don, who do you believe was involved in the murder of President Kennedy?
Well, we don't really know for sure what people, but it's pretty clear that it was a political murder done for political ends, and it was done by our own government. And it's sort of the same as Caesar and his senators. The people that killed Kennedy were involved in the CIA and the military and looked upon Kennedy as a threat to national security. Exactly who did it, we don't know. I think leading contenders are Allen Dulles, who he had fired as chief of the CIA, and James Jesus Angleton, who was the head of counterintelligence. But from my reading of it, and I think a lot of Kennedy researchers will say that while we can be virtually sure that elements of the national security state were behind the murder, exactly who planned it, we don't know, and we don't know either who the people were that actually shot the bullets.
In addition to being a phenomenal surgeon and physician, Don, you are also a historian. And when I speak about the New World Order, many people say to me, that's pure conspiracy theory, and the New World Order does not exist. Don, do you believe the New World Order exists?
There's no question about it. You can give it a lot of different names. I think the New World Order is an appropriate one, and we know exactly the date when it began. The New World Order started in 1913.
And why do you believe that?
Because Woodrow Wilson was elected president. Mm-hmm. He was a progressive, and the progressive mindset looks to government to centrally plan and control everything, which is the basic underpinning of a New World Order. And when Wilson became president, he did 3 things that changed our country for the worse, and we're seeing now the results of it. And those 3 things were, when when Wilson was elected president, mm-hmm. there was no income tax.
Right.
We had no central bank. Mm-hmm. And the country was on a gold standard. Mm-hmm. The 3 big things that happened when Wilson became president that changed this country and made it a war state, and you could call the 20th century of war the Wilsonian century. But the 3 things were that, number one, he introduced a federal income tax, which is 16th Amendment. Mm-hmm. And previously, taxes just levies and import duties and tariffs and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So the only taxes the government got, and they only collected and spent 3% of the GDP. But then with the income tax, there's a whole new source of revenue. The second thing he did was he formed the Federal Reserve Act, which made our central bank, and that gave Wilson and his successors ability to have an elastic currency and start using monopoly money, basically. The fact that we've had all these wars
mm-hmm.
is a result of the central bank that was formed that funded the New World Order. Without this source of money that could be printed, you couldn't have funded the wars. And it's very interesting that a year after the Federal Reserve was formed, it provided the source of elastic currency, the European powers went to war.
Mm-hmm.
And the first, from 1913 to 1920, the money supply had doubled. Now it's gone up a huge amount, of course, but even in the First World War, the money supply doubled. And then the third thing was Amendment 17, which was direct election of senators.
Mm-hmm.
And the senators now are just like glorified congressmen, congresswomen. They're elected by the public. In the past, before Wilson came in, state legislatures appointed their senators. And so the senators were answerable to the state and its legislators for what they voted on and did. And if the state legislators didn't like it, they could bring it back and fire them. Now they're elected just like congressmen, and they're in the pocket of the lobbyists. So that the New World Order now has the legislative side arranged so it can do its bidding.
So, Don, when I tell people, when they say, well, okay, you talk about this Kennedy assassination thing all the time, because I think it's really a hallmark event, right, for the New World Order crew. They say, when did all this start? And the seed was planted for the Kennedy assassination. I tell people the seed was planted back in 1913.
And you're absolutely right. That's when it was planted, and it's grown now to the state it's in. Because
Kennedy was hell bent to take apart the New World Order, wasn't he?
Right, and the reason the national security apparatus, military side, killed him was that he wanted to end the Cold War. Mm-hmm. He was going to take all the troops out of Vietnam. He was talking to Castro privately, talking to Khrushchev privately. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we came onto the brink of nuclear war, this World War II veteran and hero realized that wars now will be extremely catastrophic with nuclear weapons, and we've got to have a world of peace. Well, as soon as he took that approach, the military-industrial complex and all the businesses that make money making weapons said this couldn't be. We've got to get him out of here.
And he was actually also calling into question the Federal Reserve System, wasn't he?
Yes and no, but I think one place where Kennedy researchers go awry is they say that he was issuing silver dollar certificates, which competed with Federal Reserve notes, and therefore maybe the Federal Reserve wanted him gone too. Mm-hmm. But I've looked into that, and I don't think that has anything to do with it. And Kennedy passed an executive order regarding silver notes that actually was in league with phasing them out, not to be grown to compete with Federal Reserve notes. And after the Federal Reserve was formed, there were still a lot of different kinds of U.S. dollars up until 1933. Mm-hmm. And you can get them on eBay for a reasonable price. There were gold certificates, which says this $20 can be redeemed in gold. Mm-hmm. There were silver certificates that redeemed the dollar amount in silver. Mm-hmm. Federal Reserve notes were only one part of it. But then when we went off the gold standard domestically in 1933 and silver in 1965, Kennedy was not trying to put the Federal Reserve out of business. He was just dealing with the fact there was a transition. So I think people that say that the Federal Reserve had some role are incorrect.
So let's talk. You've written a great article entitled "A 14-Point Plan for the Post-Wilsonian America." It's interesting you chose 14 points because Woodrow Wilson back in 1918 extended a 14-point program, right, as he put it, for world peace. And point 14 of that program was he advocated for a new world order through the formation of a general association of nations, such as the League of Nations, correct?
Correct.
And it was actually this League of Nations that led to that he proposed and he was pushing through, that led to the Treaty of Versailles, which essentially destroyed Germany after World War I, which actually led to more carnage and actually led to World War II, correct?
Correct. And Wilson really can be blamed with good justification for having caused the rise of Hitler and Lenin and Stalin and the Second World War. Mm-hmm. And some historians say that Wilson, while some academic college professors say he's one of the great presidents, he's actually responsible for 100 million deaths from the Second World War and the carnage that Stalin and Hitler caused.
And I think even Princeton University has gone so far, and their School of Government, I believe, is called the Woodrow Wilson School of Government, isn't it?
Well, he was president of Princeton University, and sadly, they honored him with that thing.
Good old Princeton,
right? But his 14-point plan, number 6 in the plan was to welcome communist Russia into the Society of Nations.
Perfect.
And it says, and assure her, quote, assistance of every kind that she may need and may herself desire. And the 14-point plan, actually, the Treaty of Versailles didn't follow it very closely. And two things in the Treaty of Versailles, which made the Second World War preordained, was that they added a guilt clause saying that Germany was entirely responsible for the war, and also reparations, which were so high there was no way they could ever be paid. But the 14-point plan, it had to do with readjusting borders of France and Italy, and independence for Poland and the Balkan states, and freedom of the seas and so forth. But after 9/11, I was compelled to write the article you referred to called A 14-Point Plan for a Post-Wilsonian America, because I think it's clear that 9/11 is blowback for the New World Order that Wilson birthed. And Chalmers Johnson wrote a book titled Blowback, actually early in 2001, which predicted the subtitle was The Cost and Consequences of American Empire, and we're paying the price for this empire that was made with money created by the Federal Reserve and this national security state that arose.
Well, Don, let's talk about your 14-point plan that you advocate in your article. Again, folks can go to LouRockwell.com to get that. First of all, you have foreign policy and domestic policy. Briefly touch on the foreign policy aspects of your plan. Right.
Well, there were 5 parts of the plan relate to foreign policy, and the first one is that the U.S. worldwide military presence and the military troops around the world should be ended and brought home. We have troops in 130 countries, 800 installations, and that doesn't include the secret torture prisons in various places. So that's and then the second was stop economic sanctions of other countries. The whole basis of our country, with Washington and Jefferson, was to have commercial relations with all countries and no political involvement with any of them. So stop the sanctions and have unrestricted trade, be neutral in all disputes and wars, and withdraw from the United Nations.
And the domestic policy side?
The first of that one was to abolish all government restrictions on domestic energy production. And I mean, the current administration is trying to ruin the coal industry and put them out of business. safest form of power is nuclear power, which has been demonized in this country, while China is building 200 nuclear plants. The second one for domestic policy is end the war on drugs. During Wilson's presidency, the Harrison Narcotic Act was passed in 1914, and then, of course, Prohibition in 1919, beginning in 1920.
Great way for the government to get a cut, right? Cut of the action, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then the third is privatize health, education, welfare, and Social Security. The fourth is dismantle all the unconstitutional federal regulatory government agencies like EPA, FDA, OSHA, BATF. Fifth is proscribe corporate welfare and subsidies, and basically end crony capitalism. And then the sixth one, the only one of the 14, I wrote this back right after 9/11, 12 years ago. The only one I would change would be the sixth one on domestic policy, where I said return all illegal aliens to their homeland. And it's a complex subject, and the more I read about and think about this, I'm more of a follower of Ron Paul's approach, and I think that you just can't send everybody home; it'd be almost impossible. But his approach is to have more liberal work permits and